Michael, Brendan's taken you on this whirlwind tour of Australia, so you're now an expert on Australian energy policy and politics. What he didn't tell you was that there would be a pop quiz at the end of the trip, so I hope you've been taking notes as you've been meeting with regulators and departments and academics and other experts. I imagine you've got the impression that we're kind of at a moment of opportunity here in Australia. So we've got a new federal government. We've got a couple of state governments in New South Wales and Victoria probably leading the charge as well as ACT in kind of trying to unpick the consumer journey and what it means in the energy transition. Yep. So that's really exciting. But I think all the people in this room feel very keenly that we've also lost a lot of time in terms of the institutional architecture we have to support that transition. So while there's renewed interest, we're also missing some of the tools in the toolbox that will be incredibly helpful. Brendan and his team invited you over to kind of share some insights, because one of the advantages of being behind the eight ball is that we can kind of peek over the side of what some other people are doing and learn what there is to learn and kind of understand what we might need to do. And there is a question that many of us are asking ourselves is there an institutional reform agenda that we need to prosecute in order to make all our hopes and dreams a reality? I was really interested in your presentation around, the specific benefits of having an independent entity prosecuting this case, and you referenced the fact that Oregon's doing really well relative to some of your state counterparts. You've got other vehicles for driving this. Obviously, in many states in the US, the utilities are tasked with this role. In Australia, we have some vehicles in some states that are kind of have a role, but it's often departments running programs. Can you talk about what is the real value add of sort of setting up a new thing? Because it's a big ask for a government, say, set something else up. Because I'll tell you what, a ministerial advisor, you go into them and every single stakeholder say, I know you've got all these problems, I've got a solution for you. We set up a new government agency, right, and it's all going to be good.
Right.
So there's a high threshold for getting that ask across the line. What are the arguments that are really resonating in Oregon for why the Energy Trust is such an important institution in that context?
Yeah, no, great question. Well, I think one of the biggest benefits, and this was certainly the case in Oregon, of standing up a new organization like Energy Trust was that we could divorce ourselves from the historical perception that people have had of the existing institutions, right? So I think there was, regardless of at the time how you may have viewed your local utility in supporting efficiency, and our utilities don't always have the best sort of customer relations systems in place, being able to come in fresh and say, these are the goals and objectives of the new organization, hopefully engaging even some of your biggest critics and helping set that up and establish the rules and objectives of that organization is really helpful, I think. In our case, for instance, it was the market that had a lot of skepticism around efficiency with that inconsistent investment that the utilities have been doing. If you were a contractor and you were out there trying to push efficient equipment, were you going to invest in that next staff person to go do that, or the next truck that you needed to serve those customers if that funding wasn't going to be there next year? Yep. And I think there was a lot of sort of skepticism that happens when you have these. What's the maximum? What do businesses like the most, right? Stability and predictability. And if you take that away, you're not going to get them to invest the way you need to support a market. And this is a market, right? Efficiency is a market selling a technology.
So it's like ballast in the system, and it's that enabling that consistent long-term vision. And how important is that consistency in kind of the frameworks and kind of the investments that are made? I mean, you're well over 20 years in terms of the history of the Energy Trust now. How important is just that stability in the system been?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical to our success. We could not, going along, we could not have built a trade ally network of 1,600 firms to work with us if they didn't think that investment was going to be there. There's a lot of customers whose the larger commercial and industrial projects you don't replace or improve those process systems in 1 year. They need multiple year time horizons to think about how to do those capital investments. And if they don't think our incentive is going to be available on the end of that, then they're not going to take that on. So having that stable budget, having that ability to provide those incentives over multiple years is incredibly valuable, just to garnering participation and trust and support for the work that we're trying to do.
And you're also... we were talking over breakfast, and you were saying that you're actually doing a lot of the modelling and kind of crunching the data and kind of characterising the opportunity. In terms of having an institution that's really focused on, I guess, the energy efficiency, energy management, the demand side part of the energy transition, being able to communicate the numbers to government to drive decision making, has that been important as well?
Oh, absolutely. So we enjoy actually a really close relationship with our commission. In fact, even though we are an independent nonprofit, we position ourselves as being an extension of state policy to help this state achieve its energy and climate policy is how we try to have people see us. And having that connection both enables us to keep somewhat of an arm's length, right? As a nonprofit, we can be a lot more nimble than most government agencies can be. We can be a lot more innovative. We can take risk that government entities really can't, or even that utilities can't. And really help move that market forward and meet customers where they need to be met, where they are. What do they need to make their homes and businesses more efficient? Not sort of, well, this is all we have, and you either take it or leave it. We can actually sit down with them and say, well, you know what? We didn't have a solution that meets this need. Let's sit down together and figure out how to do it. And I think that's been super powerful. That independence has also garnered that respect for us. We don't have that agenda. Our mission is transparent and clear.
Yep.
We're here to help the utilities get as much efficiency as possible.
Yep.
Our analyses are open. Transparency is one of our organizational values. Everything we do is open to the public. Even our board meetings, most nonprofits, there's a public meetings law in Oregon that applies to government entities and things like that. We voluntarily follow those laws so that all of our board meetings are open to the public. All of those conversations you can observe, you can witness, you can participate in. And that has gone a long way to help people realize the claims we're making are real, the work we're doing is legitimate, and the willingness to engage you is sincere.
It's right there on the tin, isn't it? Trust.
Right.
Like you've built that, you've made that commitment and built that trust over many years and delivered what you said you would. And it's really interesting in the context of this room, which, we've been meeting here for many years, and one of the big conversations that Energy Consumers Australia has been seeking to drive is how to, I guess, re-establish trust with consumers,
right.
Which has had a few dents in the last decade and beyond. And it's really interesting, how you're saying the creation of a new vehicle for a new type of conversation with consumers is potentially one way of rebooting that conversation. Just on the data thing though, in terms of the kind of the characterisation of the demand side opportunity and that being fed into government decision making, the prioritisation of the demand side agenda. I'm really interested in that because in Australia, a lot of the energy modelling that we do, a lot of the data that's fed into government is very supply side oriented.
Yeah.
And that's very natural in a way. A lot of those exercises have been traditionally done to ensure efficient investment in the supply side of the system. They're evolving, they're getting better at that. That's a commitment that has been made, but it takes time to build that sort of granular understanding of what's going on the demand side and kind of have enough nuance in the system so you can actually do the sensitivity analysis to say, well, these investments on the supply side and these investments on the demand side are going to give us that least cost transition. Is that something that you're conscious of in Oregon, and how is that conversation going in terms of the data that you're feeding into decision makers?
Yeah, so we're definitely conscious of it. So I think, so this is an interesting question. When I was reading the ISP to better understand sort of how that works here, and then supply side and demand side both can produce the same outcome, right? It's just how you get at it. And I think as we think about it, when the utilities figure out sort of what they think their 20-year load is, they are looking at, for lack of a better term, what might be called sort of naturally occurring efficiency, right? Like what's happening in the market generally. And they take that into consideration. But I think what we do is we come in on top of that and say, if you were to be intentional, if you were to be aggressive about moving the market and securing efficiency as a resource, how much more would you get above that naturally occurring baseline? If you had the incentives, if you had the delivery infrastructure, if you had the customer support and customer service wraparound that is needed to really build and stand up that market, how much more could you get? And that's what our potential analyses are looking at, right? So we now have in-house capacity to do this work, but we used to hire contractors, consultants, to do these analyses for us, to take a look at, I mentioned in my presentation, how much is technically out there, right? How much inefficient equipment exists, and if we were just replace it all, how much savings would you get? And then of that, how much is cost effective? And then of that, how much is actually achievable if you have these dedicated programs? And that's more than what the utilities would imagine in their load growth projections. And I think because we're doing it as an independent body and doing that analysis, and that is our role, right? We don't negotiate this with the utilities. We do our model, we do our analysis, and we say, this is the 20-year potential. Now, how do we get it over those 20 years? There's a little bit of art there in sort of mapping it across the timeline. But that is the amount, and that's what we work with the utilities to secure. And they treat it that way. If you look at their IRPs, they have sort of a model with and a model without the efficiency, and what their generation mix would look like if we didn't exist. And so, it's taken very seriously. And the commission, when the utilities go to file those, the commission is very deliberate at looking, have you really engaged Energy Trust, as much as you can to get that efficiency? And when we can stand up in front of our commission with the utilities and say, yeah, we've done everything we can, this is what we think is feasible, there's a lot more trust, or more likely to acknowledge those IRPs when we're doing that. If we don't do that, they're in trouble.
I want to talk a little bit about the consumer journey. So I can't remember the name of the chap that you put up on your slides first, but he's obviously really engaged with the program. He's having fantastic family holidays because he's saving so much money on energy. It's a great story. I guess one of the things that the lowest common denominator that we see across Australia, and I'm sure this happens in the US as well, is just, we'll provide consumers with information. It's an information gap. And we'll give them the information, then they'll make rational decisions. You're obviously going a long way beyond that. I'm sort of interested in you to explain why isn't information provision enough? You're obviously doing a lot of that, but then you're actually going and having conversations with real human beings, explaining to them the particular opportunities that they have in their homes, and then supporting them on the journey until up to and including, it sounds like connecting them with contractors and making sure that that the incentives are lined up and all that kind of stuff. So tell me a little bit about why information isn't enough, and then if you can talk about that whole journey and what it's like at each step to get to the point where we're staring up at the stars in Yellowstone, sort of thanking Michael for enabling this amazing family holiday.
Hopefully they all end up. Well, I think the answer to the first question is actually pretty simple, and it's because human nature is what human nature is. Knowledge does not lead to action. Education and awareness is critically important. It's part of it. I mean, think about it. How many of us know that leading a sedentary lifestyle or being somewhat overweight is going to have negative impacts on your health in the future? How many of us actually have gym memberships that we activate and use? Knowledge is one step, but it's not the only step. And so we actually, when we think about that customer journey, we try to make sure there's a call to action in every step of the way, right? Like, how do you overcome the natural inertia that exists within human nature to take that step? Like, yes, I'll get to it tomorrow, or I'll get to it the next week, or whatever. We really try to make sure, okay, you're here, you're obviously interested. What is the next step for you? Like, do we need to send somebody in to take a look at your home, to talk about what your business might need in terms of opportunity, or it could just be sitting down with them and saying, what are your pain points? Like, what are your priorities right now, and can energy efficiency or renewable energy help solve any of those pain points? And then it's about connecting them, if the next step is to connect them to a contractor who can come out and actually work with them. It is trying to make things, I mentioned, we try to make things as easy as possible. That's not always easy, or maybe easier is the better term. I know that for me, for instance, I've taken advantage of some of our own programs and found them actually to be very easy to access. Our contractors came out, and because we have that trade ally network, because we do support those businesses to understand efficiency, to understand how to fill out our own applications, what our incentive levels are, they've worked to build that stuff into the quotes, the estimates they gave me, right? I didn't have to tell them, oh, isn't there an organization that is providing an incentive on this measure, and shouldn't I be getting an incentive?
Were you like a secret shopper in this scenario? Where you didn't tell them that you're actually, the big poo bar at the top of the pyramid, but you were just like, how are you going to handle this?
Oh, I was. I do not tell people I'm the executive director of Energy Trust when they come.
Did you tell them at the end?
I do tell them. Actually, it's funny. The solar, when we installed solar and a battery at our house, the guy I called up happened to be somebody who used to work for me at Energy Trust, who now works at a solar company. So he immediately knew who I was. So I didn't get to be anonymous. I was so upset.
Okay, so I would regard you as a relatively informed consumer. So there's obviously other types of consumers out there. I'm glad to hear it worked for you, Michael. What about more vulnerable consumers? Like, there's obviously, like, in Oregon, as in all the states of Australia, there's diverse groups. You've got renters, you've got vulnerable households, there's folk that, for a whole bunch of reasons, personal circumstances, it's going to be really hard for them to engage. What are you doing to support those more diverse groups?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, it can be. Awareness, again, is important, right? Trying to make sure that people understand, if you are going to undertake any of this type of work, working with a firm that works with Energy Trust is important. But our awareness isn't 100%, right? And we don't really have goals to make it 100%. So, one of the big ways, and this is actually kind of new for us, is to actually be engaging with community-based organizations within those communities that already established trust, right? I thought the exercise yesterday with the personas was a really interesting and telling exercise. Understanding who your customers are is critical to this. And if you treat all your customers as one sort of persona, you're going to miss a lot. And finding out from them, who do you trust? Like, is it your neighbor? Is it your mom? Is it a community organization that's been there for 30 years and that you know? And wherever it is, then we try to work with them to, we provide, actually now, we've been working on providing grant funding to those organizations so they can staff up to support that. Some of them were already doing in-home type services, so we've worked to train those staff so that when they go into a home, they can take a look at energy efficiency opportunities while they're looking at health and safety concerns, or while they're coaching them on personal finance or job finding jobs. And that has proven to be a really valuable sort of vector, if you will, for us. And we don't even need to be, I don't care if the customer at the end of this knows they got an incentive from Energy Trust.
Yep.
I care that their home is safer, more comfortable, less costly to operate, and that they had a good experience.
So we've got a question specifically on renters, and obviously there's a split incentive there that requires engaging landlords. Are you doing anything specific to support renters in Oregon? Is that a big cohort within the state?
Yeah, so this question has probably come up in every conversation with everybody that Brendan's introduced us to. So split incentives, not unique to Australia, not unique, it's just because of the way the markets are set up, right? And actually, I have worked my whole career I started my career in New York City, and that was all I did, was work in multifamily housing. And so figuring out how to deal with that. And I'll say, the tools that we have in this sort of space, using market sort of based tools, are really ineffective. We have done things like you can pay for the whole job. You can do direct install, right?
Yep.
Go in and install the work on behalf of the renters and the building owner, and don't charge them anything, or charge them very little. You can put terms in the contracts that you can't raise rents based on the funding that we provide you, although enforcement is near impossible with those things.
Yeah.
And I think to fully answer your question, I have to kind of take my hat off as the director of Energy Trust.
This is Michael Unleashed. That's what we're getting. We won't tell anyone.
But I'm not advocating. I'm just giving an idea.
Thinking out loud.
Thinking out loud.
Thinking out loud.
But I really feel that this whole split incentive issue, seen through an energy perspective or lens, is a classic market failure.
Yes.
And to me, that's what government's for. I think you have to have regulation, you have to have policy that, for instance, if they do invest in an efficiency project, they're not allowed to raise rent. They're not allowed to pass that cost on. Hopefully, maybe there's another mechanism. In the US, we have property taxes. Like, why don't we provide them a break on their property tax for a few years to help them recoup that cost? I don't want them to be beholden, to carry the bag the whole time. They deserve to be able to recoup. But does it have to be on the backs of renters?
Yep.
Is my question. And I think you have to have government, and you have to have housing advocates stepping in and having that be an issue for them. The problem is, I don't know that beyond this room in this industry, when I talk to housing advocates and mention split incentive, they don't really know what I'm talking about. Like that aspect of what we discuss with the utility, because utility bills are the least concern when you have a housing market that's 40%, less housing than it needs to be already, right? No. It's not an easy question. I'm not sure that we should be the ones to come up with that solution, because that's a bigger social problem, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, I'll speak for my organisation, the Energy Efficiency Council, have been thrilled to see ACT step up in terms of just minimum standards for rentals, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is what the minimum requirements for a healthy, comfortable, safe home look like, and Victoria is following suit.
That's great.
They're going to be running a regulatory impact statement for minimum rental standards. It'll cover things like draft-proofing, insulation, cooling, and hot water. And they've already got heating. So we're on the journey, and we're looking forward to other states following their lead. There's a couple of questions here that go to the funding. Where's all the money coming from? Like, how is that? How is the Energy Trust recurring funding, that stability funding? How has that been achieved?
Yeah. So the question is it by government or through the utilities? And the answer is really neither. The funding comes from the consumer. It comes from the ratepayer.
Yep.
Our funding is built into the rate. That 18 cents per kilowatt hour that I mentioned includes efficiency. The same way that it includes part of the hydropower system, part of the gas contracts the utility has to get power to me. It's part of the cost of the electricity. They are basically buying I've never been a big fan of megawatts, but they're basically buying efficiency from Energy Trust, just like they would be buying any other power source through the electric utility, right? We just happen to be the cheapest part of that entire mix. So it does. It comes through the tariff. It comes through the ratepayer.
There's a question here around, I guess, the relative benefits of different types of efficiency. So you've got generic efficiency, a unit that occurs it could occur at any time of the day, versus a unit of efficiency that would help you with peak demand. And you mentioned grid constraints and managing peak demand. How do you think about that? How do you target effort into measures that are going to have that broader system benefit beyond the benefit at a particular site?
Yep, great question. So peak management, load management stays with our utilities. That's their job, right? We don't have the insight into the grid. We don't know when the next event's happening or what element of their distribution system needs to be replaced. But we work very closely with them because efficiency and efficient technologies, some have two ways that they contribute to peak. Efficiency generally is a permanent load reduction measure, right? Most of these measures are saving energy, usually at the time of peak.
Yep.
Some variability, but generally speaking, they're all saving energy at some point. And that just generally lowers the whole peak curve,
Yep.
right? Others are dispatchable or callable. And so if you think about smart thermostats, for instance, or you think about grid-connected technologies like smart water heaters, they can be used to shift peak or to manage peak load events. So the utility, we have a pilot going on with our large electric utility now. Smart thermostats is one of the big places that we would provide our efficiency incentive for that smart thermostat. They would provide a peak load or demand response incentive for that same thermostat. We'd get them installed in people's homes. In order to get that incentive from the utility, you agree that they can they can drop your set point, a couple of degrees in the winter or up a couple of degrees in the summer to help them manage. And when they're managing, across tens of thousands of these systems, they can see measurable reductions. And so there is that benefit. And so we have to work really closely with our utility partners to understand how efficiency can intersect with system management and load flexibility.
There's one last question. I'll give you the curliest question on the screen, which is the approach to gas. And I know it's a long answer, and we've got 1 minute and 42 seconds, according to the screen in front of me. But I'm throwing that question to you because I think it's an opportunity to explain a little bit about where Energy Trust has come from and also maybe where it could be heading in the future.
Yeah. So my hat is back on.
Yeah.
This is a sort of a challenging question, and not in the sense. I will say I'm very jealous of sort of the environment you all are in, to be able to sort of actively promote electrification as a decarbonization strategy. Energy Trust can't do that. We actually have to operate as a fuel neutral entity because our funding does come from gas utilities and gas ratepayers. And so we have operated in that environment. We do support gas efficiency. And part of it emanates from the fact that Oregon doesn't have an explicit electrification policy. We have decarbonization goals, which I showed you in the presentation, but not an explicit electrification policy. So where does electrification fit into that decarbonization? Oregon's been a little silent on that. And they've kind of allowed the gas utilities to look at renewable natural gas, hydrogen, efficiency as ways to decarbonize their system. I will admit there's a lot of skepticism in sort of what the gas utilities are thinking when you don't include electrification. And we could play a role in electrification. There's no doubt about it. And we do suspect that over the next 5 to 6 years, we will see changes in policy. And we do suspect that the state will turn to us to help them with that.
Zero. Look at that. Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for taking time out of what is a very busy job to be with us in Australia. Please, round of applause, Michael Colgrove.